Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well and hope that your week is going well. For this video lecture, which is going to be a little bit longer than some of the other video lectures that you've watched, we're going to talk about narrative writing, and we're going to talk about narrative writing as it relates to our first formal essay of the semester, which is a narrative essay called a This I Believe essay. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what narrative writing is, what narrative essay writing is, why we do narrative, in a class like this, and how this can help you as you think about other writing assignments, not just for this class, but also for other classes that you're taking this semester, and then other classes that you'll take as a college student as well. You know, narrative has had an interesting sort of change and shift over the last several years, really the last several decades, actually, but especially the last several years. There is a theory out there. There's a lot of experts. There's a lot of teachers. There's a lot of researchers out there who don't view narrative writing as a legitimate form of writing or a legitimate form of essay construction because it deals with things that we are familiar with. It deals with our personal thoughts, our feelings, our experiences. And there's a lot of teachers and scholars out there that say, well, you're not doing the heavy, formal, serious writing. If you're not doing analysis, or if you're not doing argument, or you're not doing all research writing where you're looking at outside sources and trying to get that information cited properly and arranged properly in a paper with a works cited page, then you're not doing serious writing. Well, I think narrative has now shifted back into the conversation in terms of being a little bit more of a legitimate form of writing. And there's a reason for that because of the skills that are involved in writing narrative essays. And there's something called a craft of vision, which we won't get in right now. But this idea of a craft of vision is something that a lot of writing professors, a lot of writing scholars have been examining over the last several decades with regards to narrative and connecting writing to personal experience. And it sort of got overlooked in the last several years, really the last 10 years, because everything needed to be more serious and academic. And now that idea of a craft of vision, which was first created and established by a scholar and a writing teacher named Donald Murray, has now come back into the forefront. And really, what he's talking about with this idea of a craft of vision is what narrative writing teaches you to do as a writer and as a thinker. It focuses you on the idea of specific details. It focuses you on a sense of engagement with your topic, especially if it is something that is a personal experience for you or a personal experience connected to you, which is what our first essay is going to be dealing with. And it also forces you to deal with the topic in a cohesive manner. It teaches you the importance and the understanding of sort of a chronological structure to essay writing. And it also forces you to kind of think about lively text, lively language, lively words that can be used to convey that experience to a wide audience. And we've talked a little bit about grammar in our previous modules, word choice, and why that's important. This ties in specifically to narrative. So when you think about needing specific details, the engagement with the topic, you think about transferring that information through lively language and expression, and then following that chronological format. That is all something that can help you write a strong narrative essay, but it's also something that you can transfer into other essays and other kind of writing assignments that you'll be doing this semester in this class, but in other courses as well. So I wanted to talk for just a minute and share my screen with you, talk for just a few minutes about narrative writing more specifically. And then we're actually going to listen to a couple of This I Believe essays so that you'll get a sense and an understanding of what those are like. So let me share my screen with you. Let me go through some information with you about narrative essays, and just to give you an idea or some things to think about as we start working on drafting our own narrative essay and our own This I Believe essay. So I've given you some information about narrative writing and this idea of a craft of vision and how it's kind of gone back and forth between teachers and scholars in terms of, is narrative really a serious, legitimate type of writing? But we're going to talk a little bit about what a TIB essay is. I'll give you some background on This I Believe essays. If you see that term TIB popping up in my discussion and in the modules, you'll know that that means This I Believe. This is what that's referring to. That's the acronym I've created for it. We're going to talk about the structure of a narrative essay, and then we're going to look, as I mentioned, at a couple of sample This I Believe essays so that you get a sense of what that is. So let me tell you first about a history of This I Believe and where this essay got started. It was first started by a journalist named Edward R. Murrow, which some of you may be familiar with. If you're a journalism major, if you're interested in journalism, maybe you have heard of his name. He was a correspondent for CBS News back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was a journalist who, at that particular time, was the most trusted journalist, the most well-respected journalist that we had in our country. So if Edward R. Murrow said it was to be true, then it had to be true. He was also a correspondent that went and covered events during World War II. He was a journalist who was very much interested in how events that were taking place in society connected to individuals and connected to people's personal experience. There was a movie that was done a number of years ago called Good Night and Good Luck, which was starring Frank Langella and David Strathairn. David Strathairn played Edward R. Murrow, and Frank Langella played his boss, Bill Paley, at CBS News. And it's all the whole story of Murrow's career as a journalist and why he felt like world events impacted individuals on a day-to-day basis, no matter if it was something taking place overseas in Europe during World War II, or if it was a major national event. It had ramifications for people everywhere. And that was kind of his thrust as a journalist and kind of what he did and kind of what he focused on in a lot of his work and his reporting. But he was the most trusted journalist of his era. Some of you might remember or have heard about Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings and Dan Rather. If your parents and grandparents might talk a lot about Walter Cronkite, who was another journalist, a television journalist at CBS News. Brokaw, Peter Jennings, and Dan Rather were the three anchors at ABC, NBC, and CBS when I was growing up. Those were, who you watched for the national news at that particular time. Of course, this was before you had 24-hour news, before you had before you had Politico and FoxNews.com and all these other things. To get news from, you sat down and watched the 6:30 news to find out what happened in the country, and Brokaw, Jennings, and Rather delivered that information. Well, Edward R. Murrow was that kind of a journalist for his generation, although TV wasn't invented and wasn't really kind of in its infancy stages back when Murrow was really, really establishing himself and really, really famous and well-respected as a journalist. So Murrow lived to the early 1960s. He died of lung cancer in the early 1960s. But towards the end of his career, after he came back from World War II and reporting over there, he started something called This I Believe essay series, which was on CBS Radio. And this ran for 4 years from 1951 to 1955. And at that particular time, TV had been invented. But I'll talk more about television here in just a minute. But it was very much in its infancy stages. It was something that was very new to society. Owning a television was extremely expensive, and not very many people in the country could afford one. And so most people got their information by the radio. Most people got their news by the radio. They listened to sports on the radio. They listened to soap operas on the radio, comedy programs on the radio. You gathered around the radio and listened to that information and those programs just like we do with television today, or maybe even your laptop or your computer screen today. People did that of all ages around the radio. And so Murrow's This I Believe essay series reached 39 million listeners. And the purpose and the impetus of This I Believe was to invite people from all over the country to write to him letters and essays about personal experiences that mattered to them. Personal values, beliefs that mattered to them, experiences that mattered to them, experiences that taught them a lesson or taught them something about themselves or something about life in general. He invited people to write to him. Back in the old days when we sent things through the mail, there was no email back then. There was no scanning and faxing and all of those things that we're familiar with. You had to actually write it out. If you were fortunate enough to have a typewriter, you could type it up. You mailed it in to CBS News in New York, and Edward R. Murrow would go through and pick out the essays that he liked the best, or the essays that he felt were best for his program. Well, this was an extremely popular program for 4 years on CBS Radio. He had 39 million listeners from that period of 1951 to 1955, which was tremendous. That was some of the most listened to programming that CBS produced. And so he would sit down and read a 5-minute essay about this personal philosophy or this personal belief or value and how it connected to an experience to the audience. Later on, as the program became more popular, there was a collection of This I Believe essays published in 1952 by Random House Publishers in New York. It sold more than 300,000 copies in 1952, which was extremely good for this type of a book at this type, in this period, in this type of decade in American history. So people were interested in hearing about other people's beliefs, values that impacted them, and how those beliefs and values oftentimes connected to an experience that impacted them. I mentioned television. Here's just a quick little anecdote about television. Television was a novice idea in the 1950s. Only very wealthy families could afford them because the TVs were extremely expensive. How expensive were they? Take a look at this. The average cost of a television in the early 1950s was $500. If you translate that into 2022 dollars and cents, it was over $5,000 in today's money. So it would be like if you went out and paid $5,000 for a new flat screen television or a new smart TV. That's how much televisions in the early 1950s cost. Most televisions during that period only had 3 to 4 channels. You had ABC, CBS, NBC. In the 1960s, you would have PBS. Every community had a PBS station. But what you found most of the time was the TV was white most of the time. There were certain programs that came on those networks at certain times in the early to mid 1950s. But most of the time, when you turned on the television, it was white. It was just nothing but static. It's not like today where you can turn on the TV, any channel, all day, all night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And there's going to be something on that channel to air or to provide content. Well, that wasn't the case in the 1950s. If there was not a program, if the news wasn't being aired, if maybe a soap opera wasn't being aired, if the I Love Lucy show wasn't being aired or something like that, the TV was static. You turn it on and nothing would come on. So just something to think about with television as we think about kind of why Edward R. Murrow made his claim to fame with This I Believe on radio. So let's shift away and talk a little bit about narrative essays. I just give you some background about This I Believe. Keep that in your mind, in the back of your mind as we go forward here, because we'll come back to some This I Believe essays in just a little bit. But narrative essays do a couple of things. So when you think about writing a narrative essay for this assignment, here's some things to think about. A narrative is a story. So you are going to tell a story about a belief or a value or an experience that has impacted your life. And we'll get more into that as we work through the modules over the next couple of weeks. But keep that in mind, that a narrative is primarily a story, and it is a story that has a specific point. So we're not writing about our best friend. We're not writing about our favorite food. We're not writing about what we did this summer. We're not writing about those issues and dealing with those issues. We are looking at a narrative essay that is going to talk about a value or belief that has impacted you or influenced your life, and that could be connected to a personal experience that you witnessed. And we'll look at some sample student essays as well when we get a little closer to that in the module. But narrative essays oftentimes will strive to teach a lesson. A narrative essay oftentimes is trying to make a specific point. But what a narrative essay is, it is not a diary entry. What I mean by that is it is not a dear diary. Today I went to class and then came home and ate lunch. After that, I took a nap. Then I got up and went and took a walk. And then I met my friends for dinner over at Rebel Market, blah, 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 blah. It's not a listing of events. It's not a listing of things that you did during the day or your perceptions on what happened that day. Oh, I went to lunch with Jane at Rebel Market. She was wearing this T-shirt that really looked bad on her. Or I went and had lunch with Rob over in the student union. And he'd gotten a haircut and it made his ears stick out or whatever it might be. We're not writing that kind of a narrative. That is more of an epistolary style of writing, which we're not dealing with. So it's not a diary entry. You're going to be writing an essay that has a point, has a purpose, and has information that's going to be connected to that. So when you think about writing a This I Believe essay, as you build off some of those principles of narrative, keeping in mind what I said a little while ago about this idea of the craft of vision that Donald Murray talked about. One of the things that we want to do with that particular focus as we look at This I Believe essays is think about specific details, think about your level of engagement with the topic, the chronological structure, as well as the language and the descriptions and what you're going to use to convey that story to the reader. That's what we're kind of focusing on with this, and you can't get that necessarily in a diary entry. So This I Believe essay is authentic, it's vulnerable, and it's poignant. It accomplishes those three things. It's authentic because it's going to be your experience. There is a little bit of vulnerability. When you're writing about yourself, when you are writing about a personal experience or a belief or a value that defines you, there is a little bit of vulnerability because you're going back to a moment in time, maybe recently, maybe far back in the past, that is impactful to you. And so you're a little bit vulnerable in kind of thinking back and reflecting on why that was so important to you. And it's poignant for all those reasons that I talked about a moment ago with the craft of vision, with the details, with the chronological structure, with the connection and the engagement that you have. All of that makes it poignant. So here are some common themes that you will see in this, I believe, essays. These can be things like romance, a romance that had an impact on you, family, a family connection or experience or loss, or some kind of trauma that was connected to that, growing up. There's a lot of this, I believe, essay topics on nature, spirituality, the idea of neighbors. What does it mean to be a neighbor? The idea of home, death, etc. And again, we'll get more into that in the themes for this, I believe, essays later, but those are typically common themes that you'll see emerge in these kinds of essays. Plus, I like this, I believe, essays because it creates a sense of community. You may have an essay where you're focusing on something that happened with your family that someone else who is reading that essay can connect with, and they can say, oh, I had a very similar experience, or I had a similar experience, but mine was a little different in that it involved someone else. It wasn't my mom or dad that was involved, it was a grandparent. Or it wasn't my grandparents that was involved in a similar circumstance, it was my brother or sister. So creates this sense of community, because what happens oftentimes is the reader and writer is sharing an experience through the story that you are telling. So you want to think about your narrative essay as having structure. We did that RET Lab module on Beyond the 5-Paragraph Essay. We talked about, and you had a chance to look at some of those issues. But your essay is going to have 3 parts: an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. We'll talk about the narrative hook here in just a second. Give you a chance to see what I mean by a narrative hook. The body is where you're really you're gonna tell the story. You are going to explain how that experience came to be, how you felt when it occurred, what happened, who was involved. All of those kind of details with regards to your essay get addressed there, and then you'll ultimately have a conclusion. So what will help you in that body section create that those details? You want to think about where your story took place and when it took place. You want to think about the theme. What is the value belief that has impacted you, and how was the experience of that in practice connected to how you felt about that value or belief. So if you're writing about family and how you never get over the loss of a loved one, then when did that happen? Where did it happen? How do you feel about that? Why did you get to that particular example? For example, if I was writing an essay, this, I believe, essay on that about the loss of a loved one, I would write about the loss of my father. My father passed away from pancreatic cancer when I was very young. The theme that I'm looking at, and theme I would write about for that particular topic about losing a loved one, is I have many days where it seems like he's been gone. He died yesterday. I have many days where it feels like it's been 20 some years ago when he died. And so it's odd how that changes. And some days it feels like it just happened yesterday, and some days it feels like 20 some years ago. And I would have a story that shows that in practice, and an experience, and what occurred or when it occurred, and why it led me to that theme. So that's something to keep in mind. Your story will have a mood. Obviously, if I'm writing about that particular example that I just shared with you, it's going to have a more somber, sad tone than maybe something funny that might have happened to you. There's going to be characters involved. And what I mean by characters is not fictional characters, but in the story I would write, my mother certainly would be involved in this story. She doesn't feel the same way that I do about that. She feels like that, yes, my dad's been gone for 25 years. It feels like 25 years to her. She doesn't have those days where it feels like it just happened yesterday. For her, it's been so long ago. It's been 4 or 5 years ago now that he's been gone. So those are kinds of the things she would be worked into my story, and I would explain a conversation perhaps that we had, or whatever. And then there is going to be a plot, as I mentioned, the chronological sort of perspective from start to finish with regards to your narrative. So I want to talk about the narrative hook. This kind of gets the reader engaged and gets them wanting to know more about your story, more about your value, more about your belief. You want to make sure that the reader kind of second guesses what's going to happen next, or gets plugged in and really wants to follow through the end of the narrative. We talked about this earlier in a previous video lecture with grammar. You want the reader to get from line 1, paragraph 1, all the way to line 8 in paragraph 5 or 6 of your essay. You want that to be the case with this I believe, narrative essay as well. And you do that by creating this narrative hook. So I'm just going to put some sentences up on the screen here, let you look at them for just a second. And I want you to think about, you don't have to put an X next to these sentences unless you really want to, but which ones hook you and engage you and make you want to read more and make you want to start asking questions about what happened with this particular story or this particular experience. So I'm just going to flash these up on the screen, give you just a minute to take a look at them, and then I'll just comment on a couple of them here as we look at this. Okay, if that wasn't enough time for you to get through those, I tried to pick some simple sentences that were easy to read. Feel free to scroll back through. Feel free to pause the lecture on this screen so that you can take a look at them. I'm just going to comment on a couple of these as to why they're a better narrative hook than others. Let's just take a look at the first two. She gave her friend a birthday gift. Okay, well, that is a statement of something that could have happened as part of the story, as part of that value or belief or the experience that the writer is writing about. But this doesn't really give us a lot of information. It doesn't kind of tell us when, where, why, or how this took place. It doesn't tell us really who she is. It doesn't tell us the name of her friend. It doesn't tell us what kind of a birthday gift it was. Was it wrapped, wrapped with a bow on top? Did it come in a big box or a small envelope? Was it given to her on her birthday? Was it given to her before her birthday? Was it given to her late? The friend forgot about the birthday. And now she's sort of, we've all done that. And if you haven't, you will. Somebody has a birthday and you're like, oops, sorry about that, but here's my belated birthday gift. None of those questions really get identified just in that one particular sentence. She gave her friend a birthday gift. As a reader, I'm wanting to know more. I want to know who's involved, what size of the gift. Was it wrapped? Did you give it to her on her birthday? When was her birthday? Was it in May, August, December? If you give somebody a birthday gift on Christmas Day because they were born on Christmas Day, that has a different impact and a different feel than if you give somebody a birthday gift in the middle of July. So those are the kinds of questions that pop into my mind when I'm thinking about that. Let's look at number two. The gleaming snow lay over the treacherous mountain like a soft white blanket, making the terrain seem safe instead of deadly. Think about that. Think about how much more information is provided in that particular sentence than what we had before. Gleaming snow. Okay, so I know that this must be wintertime, or this must be a place where the weather is quite cold, because snow can't, isn't around in the summertime. Treacherous mountains. Okay, I know where we are. Not only are we maybe during the wintertime or a cold part of the year, but we're on a mountain. And this mountain is treacherous. This is not a smooth mountain. This is not a mountain that is easy to be a part of or easy to navigate. Like a soft white blanket. I've gotten an image of what that snow looks like on the mountain, almost like a soft white blanket laying on top of it, making the terrain seem safe instead of deadly. That idea of safe and deadly gives me an idea, some things to think about with regards to this particular example, or maybe this particular experience that's going to be written about. So when we talk about that craft of vision I was mentioning earlier, and we talk about the words and the word choice and the language and the way that you express information and ideas with this essay, this is an example of how you can do that by using specific details, sensory imagery details, giving the reader a sense of where we are, what time it is, what's going on, is this person or this situation serious, dangerous, humorous, fun, all of that. And then you can see how those concepts apply to the other examples as well. So when you're thinking about writing your own narrative essay and your own This I Believe essay, you want a lot more statements like sentence 2, because that is going to give the reader the information they need to understand your value or belief much more specifically. Okay, so tips for writing a good narrative essay. Some of this was covered in that Beyond the 5-Paragraph Essay module. A thesis, certainly, you want to have that, and we'll look at some examples of how to do that later in the modules. Transition sentences that sort of connect everything together, and then a conclusion that serves as a final purpose for that particular essay. Okay, so we are going to look at a couple of This I Believe essays, and I apologize for this lecture going long, but I felt like it was worth our time to look at a couple of This I Believe essays just so you get a feel for what those are like. As you are looking at these This I Believe essays, here are some questions that you can ask yourself. And I'm not going to ask you to respond to these. I'm not going to ask you to apply these questions or write me a response to the ones that we're going to listen to. But here are just some questions that you can ask yourself as you are listening to and looking at this I Believe essay. And so you're welcome to pause the lecture here if you'd like to write these down, or if you just want to maybe open up another window and put these on the screen, or copy and paste them into a Word document. But these are some things that can help you determine how successful is this particular This I Believe essay. So I just wanted to put those up on the screen for you and give you a chance to look at those. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for just a second. This is going to be a little clunky because I've got two different essays that I want us to listen to because they're very different in tone and very different in feel, and they're very different in writing style. The first one that I'm going to share with you is one that I think you're probably familiar with. At least it's written by someone that you are familiar with. And this is Tony Hawk, who is the famous skateboarding person, famous skateboarder. One of the things that you will see when you go to the This I Believe site, which is up here at the top of the screen, you can see that, thisibelieve.org. I'll have directions on where to find essays in the website a little bit later. This is run by National Public Radio. They took over This I Believe and the This I Believe essay series after Edward R. Murrow died in the late 50s, early 1960s. So they've been categorizing and collecting more and more of these essays that people have written about beliefs, values, and experiences that have impacted them, either positively or negatively. And this is one that was submitted by Tony Hawk, the famous skateboarder. One of the things I like about this particular essay is that you can actually listen to him reading it while you follow along with the text. And so the title of this essay is called Do What You Love. And this was written by Tony Hawk. And so we'll listen to this and you can follow along. If you want to follow along, you want to actually pull up this essay, you just need to go to thisibelieve.org, look for search essays, and just type in Tony Hawk's name, and this will come up. But here's an example of Tony Hawk and him sharing his This I Believe essay with the audience.
The next essay comes from the icon of skateboarding, Tony Hawk, whose accomplishments extend beyond the sport to a successful touring roadshow and one of the best-selling video games of all time. Tony Hawk's commitment to his work is intense. He got his first board at age 9, went pro at 14, and he's never stopped. He said skateboarding is his means of expression.
I believe that people should take pride in what they do, even if it is scorned or misunderstood by the public at large. I have been a professional skateboarder for 24 years. For much of that time, the activity that paid my rent and gave me my greatest joy was tagged with many labels, most of which were ugly. It was a kid's fad, a waste of time, a dangerous pursuit, a crime. When I was about 17, 3 years after I turned pro, my high school careers teacher scolded me in front of the entire class about jumping ahead in my workbook. He told me that I would never make it in the workplace if I didn't follow directions explicitly. He said I'd never make a living as a skateboarder, so it seemed to him that my future was bleak. Even during those dark years, I never stopped riding my skateboard and never stopped progressing as a skater. There have been many, many times when I've been frustrated because I can't land a maneuver. I've come to realize that the only way to master something is to keep at it, despite the bloody knees, despite the twisted ankles, despite the mocking crowds. Skateboarding has gained mainstream recognition in recent years, but it still has negative stereotypes. The pro skaters I know are responsible members of society. Many of them are fathers, homeowners, world travelers, and successful entrepreneurs. Their hairdos and tattoos are simply part of our culture, even when they raise eyebrows during PTA meetings. So here I am, 38 years old, a husband and a father of 3, with a lengthy list of responsibilities and obligations. And although I have many job titles, CEO, executive producer, senior consultant, foundation chairman, bad actor, the one I am most proud of is professional skateboarder. It's the one I write on surveys and customs forms, even though I often end up in a secondary security checkpoint. My youngest son's preschool class was recently asked what their dads do for work. The responses were things like, "My dad sells money," and "My dad figures stuff out." My son said, I've never seen my dad do work. It's true, skateboarding doesn't seem like real work, but I'm proud of what I do. My parents never questioned the practicality behind my passion, even when I had to scrape together gas money and regarded dinner at Taco Bell as a big night out. I hope to pass on the same lesson to my children someday. Find the thing you love. My oldest son is an avid skater, and he's really gifted for a 13-year-old, but there's a lot of pressure on him. He used to skate for endorsements, but now he brushes all that stuff aside. He just skates for fun, and that's good enough for me. You might not make it to the top, but if you're doing what you love, there is much more happiness there than being rich or famous.
Okay. So you get a sense of Tony Hawk and the value or belief that has impacted him and has affected him, and that is doing what you love, and that is finding something that you love to do every day, doing it well, and if you do, you'll be happy and fulfilled. And you've maybe heard this expression: if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. My grandfather and my dad both used that expression growing up, and that's kind of what Tony Hawk is getting at here. So you can see the experience. You can see some of the storytelling that he is doing there. You can see he brings his son in. He brings his teacher in, his careers teacher, as another character. We were talking about that a minute ago. You can see how he gives us a sense of setting and place and time and how things evolved chronologically. Those are some kinds of things that you want to copy into and pattern your own "This I Believe" essay after. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing here for just a moment. I am now going to go to a different "This I Believe" essay, and let me see if I can share this one with you. This one's very different in tone, it's very different in structure, but I did want you to have a chance to hear this one. This one is called Your Inner Voice, and the idea and the concept of trusting your inner voice. This was created and produced and written by Kristine Todd Whitman, who used to be the former secretary for the Environmental Protection Agency under George W. Bush. So some of you maybe have heard of her name, or maybe you're familiar with what she did. But she was a politician. She calls herself a bureaucrat. She's been a consultant. But the title of her essay is "To Hear Your Inner Voice." And so you can look at those questions that I showed you earlier in the PowerPoint presentation, but I want you to notice how different in tone and different in mood and the different way that she sets up this essay, which is a little structured differently than Tony Hawk's essay. But I think you'll see that it has many of the same components that we want to use in our own "This I Believe" essays, but also what also makes for good narrative writing as well. So I'm going to let you listen to Kristine Todd Whitman as well.
Something we ask of all our essayists is that they look inside themselves to find their own internal compass. Kristine Whitman did that, and in fact discovered that her belief is in the very act of looking inside, and maybe more to the point, the act of listening. So here she is with her essay for "This I Believe."
If I have learned nothing else during the course of my life, I've learned to listen to my inner voice. Everyone has one. We call it different things: our moral compass, a gut feeling, following our heart. Whatever we name it, we should always pay attention to it. It makes us who we are. 9 years ago, I was in the second year of my second term as governor of New Jersey. I loved that job, and I was working hard to make what would be my last term due to term limits as productive as my first. Toward the end of that term, a U.S. Senate seat opened for New Jersey, and I quickly came under intense pressure to throw my hat into the ring. As soon as I said yes, I knew I should have said no. Deep down, I knew I didn't want to run for the Senate. I could do much more as my state's chief executive than I could in Washington, where I would be just 1/100th of 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government. And the idea of appealing to special interests for the money I would have to raise didn't sit well with me. My inner voice was telling me loud and clear, don't do it. I didn't listen. In the end, all it took was one trip to Washington, D.C. as a Senate candidate to know that I just couldn't see this through. So I dropped out of the race, returned the money that we had raised, and went back to being governor. My aborted campaign wasn't one of my finer moments, but it reaffirmed my belief in following my inner voice. A far more personal moment came when my inner voice told me to do something, and I didn't listen. It was the night before my brother's third heart surgery when I visited him in the hospital. After a walk down the hall and a light talk about our children, it was time to leave. As I saw him lying in his hospital bed, I had an overwhelming urge to give him a hug and wish him luck. That kind of emotional display was out of character for us, and I thought it might tell him I was worried, so I didn't do it. My brother didn't survive the surgery. As I look back, I know that most of the mistakes I have made have come when I didn't listen to myself, when I didn't trust my instincts. There's so much coming at us every day that life can get very confusing. But as I have always told my children, there is only one person with whom you go to bed every night and get up with every morning, and that's you. Sometimes you stop paying attention to yourself. I believe you need to listen carefully to hear your inner voice, and then you have to do what it says.
That's Kristine Todd Whitman with her essay for This I Believe. We're hoping that Tell Me More listeners will take a moment to listen to their inner convictions and maybe write them down for our series. So at npr.org/This I Believe, there's lots of information, and you can read and hear all the essays in our series. For This I Believe, I'm Jay Allison. It's something we ask of all our...
Okay, let me stop that there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I just wanted to wrap up the video lecture on narrative writing and This I Believe essays with giving you a chance to listen to a couple sample essays, just so you get a sense for the feel and the makeup of This I Believe essays. Now, we're going to be doing something a little different with our essays. We're going to be expanding these a little more. We're going to have a little bit more detail. Our essays are going to be a little bit longer than what we just saw here. In fact, some of the essays that you will see on This I Believe on the website, even if you can't hear the person actually reading them, the actual writer reading them, but if you just read along, a lot of them have been edited for brevity. A lot of them were a lot longer and more detailed, and NPR has just kind of condensed them down so they can be something that people can listen to in a 2 or 3 minute soundbite. So we're going to kind of do a little bit more detailed, more longer, more specific narrative This I Believe essay, but we'll get into more of that in the modules, and we'll kind of unpack what this is and how to put all of this together as we go forward. We'll look at some sample student essays as well, so you'll get a chance to see how those were done in the past and get an opportunity to weigh in on that, those essays, and evaluate those based on a lot of those narrative questions that I gave you in the PowerPoint. So apologize for the long video lecture. We won't have too many more that are this length, but I did want to give you a chance to hear some This I Believe essays, just so you get a feel for how they're structured, and also talk a little bit about narrative writing and what This I Believe essays are. So please let me know if you have any questions or comments or concerns as you go through the module activities this week, and take care, and I'll see you again soon.